I suspect that there is no psalm that is recited more often than Psalm 50 or 51 if you use the Hebrew numbering. In some communities and personal practices, it might be recited up to 8 times a day. And it includes that interesting line, "Behold, I was shapen in wickedness, and in sin hath my mother conceived me." Now, I was shapen mostly in mid-nowhere, and I don't think it was any more sinful than most other places at the edge of nowhere or the like. We certainly didn't consider ourselves Sin City, but well, all of sin and fallen short of the glory of Las Vegas. And in San Diego did my mother conceive me. And when I consider this verse of this psalm, I don't think about my mother's sinfulness. I mean, she was not the Immaculate Conception. I can remember one time that she seemed a little, well, she could hold a grudge, let's put it that way. And I think she only lied perhaps one time in her life. My brother well, he was an interesting fellow. And he came back home after being gone for a while, and he brought a bulldog with him. He was always bringing home some critters. And my mother told me later, and she was a Baptist, so it wasn't a confession, so I can share this. And my brother had died by that time, and she told me that she had actually taken the bulldog far out to the country and let it out, and then told my brother that the bulldog had just run away. No, I rather think that this is about, and this is kind of a more Maximus the Confessor understanding of sin, perhaps, than Augustine of Hippo, that I was conceived in the midst of the sin that is the result of humans' fall. And, it was just the end of World War II, and although there are those who disagree with me about this, as we'll see in a minute, I can't help but think that World War II was a great party for the demons, for the evil one. It's interesting, in the West, we mostly say the Our Father is deliver us from evil, and in the East, we mostly say deliver us from the evil one. And, already we are beginning to understand here kind of this move that much of the church has made into some sort of abstraction, rather than the idea that there might actually be demons out there. Oh, did I mention that this is the feast of St. Anthony of the Desert? I should mention that now, because it's in that context that I'm making this video. And of course, St. Anthony is famous for going to the desert and struggling against demons. Anyway, so, there it was, the end of World War II. And my mother had gone out to the coast to meet my father when his ship came in. And it's interesting when I think about World War II, because my father was part of a secret sort of electronic, I never quite knew what it was, but he operated this stuff that was supposed to kind of disguise the Americans landing in Japan if there hadn't been the bomb and the approaching Russians, and therefore the Japanese surrender. And had that happened, my father would have probably not come back to San Diego. And when he did come back, and I was conceived and then later born, as I mentioned, in nowhere where I was shapen, they named me for a friend of theirs, a brave Marine who had died in the war. But it was interesting, they didn't tell me that until much, in fact, my father never mentioned his friend. My mother only told me many years later, and I think this was largely because they were trying to replace the sort of black and white imagery of the war years with the full color wonders of the post-war years. And out of sight, out of mind, anyway. But there I was, being shapen in mid-nowhere. And I had the great fortune to have been born when I was, because had I been born just a little later, I would have been too young to have been in the last class at my high school that enjoyed the wonderful teaching of Edith Shannon, who taught English literature and Latin. And that is misleading about Mrs. Shannon. St. Edith, more or less. St. Edith of the Columns, and if you are one of the guys who was in high school with me, or gals, you'll know what I'm talking about, and if not, well. Anyway, she did teach English literature and quite well, and she also did teach Latin. I can still bumble my way through St. Jerome thanks to Mrs. Shannon, but she also taught us much more. She would not be allowed to teach these days, and in fact she saw what was happening with education, and she thought it was not going well, and she retired after I graduated. And she was always bringing in books that she had been reading and sharing with them, and one of the books that she brought in was the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And I had not thought much about that book until I was looking at the calendar and noticing, oh yes, St. Anthony of the Desert is coming up. Now, years later, after graduating from dear old Jonesboro High, I entered seminary. It was not a very good seminary. It was a Presbyterian seminary. I mean, the professors were, from Harvard and Princeton and Princeton and Princeton and Princeton and Princeton Presbyterians. Oh, and there was my best professor actually was from Boston College. But I entered as an Episcopalian, and the then bishop had plans to start an Episcopal Studies program at this seminary, which went because of, well, church politics, and the diocese got divided, and that's a whole other story. But in some class, and I don't remember what it was, we read Richard Foster's book, Celebrating the Disciplines, which seemed odd to a lot of the folks who, you just open the Bible and you read what it says there, and if you're Sergeant York and you've been a lifelong pacifist and it says kill the buggers, you go out and kill the buggers. And it was interesting because one of the things that Foster mentioned was Anthony of the Desert. I don't think we went so far as actually reading the life of St. Anthony. I think that would have caused some people to want their tuition back. But I think it was, as I remember, there was no one else in the class who took St. Anthony seriously. Now, maybe because I had not overcome my demons at that time. Still haven't overcome my demons, and some of them are the same old demons. I wonder what Uncle Wormwood calls them. But I took this work seriously, and as I say, I was kind of, laughed at for the idea that indeed there might be actual demons that evil might actually occupy, possess people. And, you know, fallen angels, well, they're in the Bible, but most of the folks were kind of more interested in the rapture, so I don't know. Anyway, it was an interesting insight into popular Christianity in the Mid-South at the time. But then, looking back on St. Anthony and how he was received by that class made me remember Screw Tape Letters and St. Jack of the Inklings. And if you haven't read Screw Tape Letters, it's been a while, I recommend it. I see this video is already 10 minutes long. I don't know how long I'm willing expecting you to endure it. But in many ways, I think Screw Tape Letters is a better understanding of the struggle that St. Anthony had in the desert for our times. Did I make a sentence there? I think Screw Tape Letters is a better guide to the struggle against the demons for our time than even St. Anthony of the Desert. And I read a little bit from letter 7. I've got the Kindle version because there's only so much room in the tin can for books. My dear Wormwood, I wonder you should ask me whether it is essential to keep the patient in ignorance of your own existence. That question, at least for the present phase of the struggle, has been answered for us by the High Command. Our policy for the moment is to conceal ourselves. Of course, this has not always been so. We are really faced with a cruel dilemma. When the humans disbelieve in our existence, we lose all the pleasing results of direct terrorism, and we make no magicians. On the other hand, when they believe in us, we cannot make them materialists and skeptics, at least not yet. I have great hopes that we shall learn in due time how to emotionalize and mythologize their science to such an extent that what is, in effect, a belief in us, although not under that name, will creep in, while the human mind remains closed to belief in the enemy. The life force, the worship of sex, and some aspect of psychoanalysis may here prove useful. If once we can produce our perfect work, the materialist magician, the man not using, but veritably worshipping what he vaguely calls forces, while denying the existence of spirits, then the end of the war will be in sight. Well, may the force be with you, right? Science says I don't know how much of St. Jack of the Inklings I want to actually read. I want to encourage you to read it. And one of the things I think that is quite insightful is that the temptation is to love folks who are far away from us and heartily dislike our neighbors. You know, it's interesting that Jesus says to forgive our enemies, but to love our neighbors. And it is often, I think, harder to love our neighbors than to forgive our enemies. One thing that I do find kind of interesting about Lewis is that he doesn't look at war quite so demonically as I do, and he's writing these letters at the beginning of World War II, or as I like to think of it as the second act of the Great War, and he of course had been in the trenches in the first act of the Great War. and we are sort of in between scenes. I forget the fancy French word for what I'm trying to say. Perhaps gearing up for the third act of the Great War. But he says that the great disadvantage to the evil one of wars is that it makes us aware of our own mortality. And therefore, we sometimes might think about matters that otherwise we could easily ignore in our great rush to amuse ourselves to death. In fact, if I were going to think about the presenting sin of having been shapen in nowhere, is that well, it was a time that we were freed from the strictures of rationing and shortages of World War II. The sky was the limit. My parents bought a wonderful mid-century modern house for pennies now. I think they paid less than $13,000 for it, and you know, there were cars with fins and all that stuff. We were all about entertainment, and religion was the entertainment of Sunday morning, and the rest of the time, well, you know, we could do those other things that we did. Now, I'm not going to try to argue you into believing in demons. That's one of the things that Wormwood tells Screwtape is that, you know, you don't get people to really come over to their side by arguments. I forget who it is. Maybe Chesterton, who said, you know, you can't convince someone they're wrong, that a position they hold is wrong by argument if the reason they hold it was not chosen rationally. I'm making a mess of that, but you know, very few of our core beliefs, I think, we really come to rationally. But I would suggest that we don't necessarily know so much more than people did last week. We often think we do a whole lot more than people ever knew before, because after all, we have faster internet, and you know, better magic. Well, where does magic come from? What is magic? And I will just say that, you know, if you don't believe that there are any forces out there that are trying to ruin your life, ruin this life and your afterlife, well, I mean, you know, belief in an afterlife, belief in eternity is a pretty strange thing these days anyway. Wormwood has won, you know. So, as I find that the demons that attacked me when I was in high school and in seminary and afterwards are still there, I guess I should go to psychoanalysis, right? Or invest in Tesla. Or I can accept what has been considered the wisdom of the church for a good long while now, and pray to be delivered from the evil one. Well, I would of course be delighted to hear your comments about demons, and whether it's better to go off to the desert and fight them where you know what you're doing, or stay here in the midst of the world where there are lots of distractions. And meanwhile, thanks for watching, and may the force be with you.